Welcome to One Last Take, a podcast about seeing film from every angle. I'm Wes Skinner, and our first episode will be a retrospective on my favorite films of 2025. Hope you enjoy. This felt like a fitting way to kick things off because, while it might not have felt this way in the moment, 2025 turned out to be a titan of a film year. At least it's one I felt particularly inspired by, and I'm hopeful its influence will resonate within the medium for years to come. The rise of original stories that kick down the doors of popular culture, as well as the underwhelming performance of a lot of franchise fare, signaled a potential paradigm shift for the industry. Any year where a Prohibition-era vampire musical and a comedian-helmed horror movie stir up this much conversation is an immediate all-timer in my book. In this episode, I'll be breaking down some of my favorite movies of the year, all sorted by genre, covering everything from underrated gems to instant classics. Not everything will fit neatly into a category, and some could qualify for more than one genre, so I did my best to sort them out based on what I felt each movie set out to do. At the end, we'll wrap things up with my personal top 10 films of 2025. I'll also take this time to provide the obligatory disclaimer that these are my personal favorites. If you disagree, that's okay. Feel free to share your opinion in the comments, just try to keep it nice down there. There's no need to go trolling up the place. If you don't hear about a certain movie in a certain category, hang tight because there's a chance I reserved it for the top 10. And any films that go completely unmentioned were either ones that didn't leave much of an impression or simply movies I just didn't get to see. So let's get things started with the franchise blockbusters of 2025, a category I'd call the Band-Aid in need of ripping off when it comes to movies that came out this past year. I found myself disappointed by a lot of the heavy hitters, while surprisingly going to bat for some of the more polarizing ones. For example, on the superhero front, I struggled to get on board with either James Gunn's Superman or Marvel's Fantastic Four: First Steps. I found the former well-cast and colorful, yet suffering from an excess of characters and ideas, while the latter was a bafflingly lethargic slog that failed to live up to the potential of its unique setting. And it's probably best we don't talk about Captain America: Brave New World, or as I like to call it, the MCU compost pile. The superhero movie that did work for me this year, however, was Marvel's Thunderbolts. In keeping with its titular team of misfits, this movie was the odd man out of the genre this year. No one really expected it to bomb, but with the recent slump in enthusiasm for superhero stories, and in turn their uncertain future, no one seemed to know if it would actually work either. Fortunately, thanks to its tight story, poignant themes, and charismatic cast led by the ever-reliable Florence Pugh, Thunderbolts delivered. In a so obvious its brilliant premise, the B-tier roster starts off pitted against each other before they realize they've been duped by the same corrupt government official. This setup allows the typically infamous MCU banter to occur naturally, making for more genuine humor this time around. And when the action takes over, it's easy to follow, well choreographed, and carries an actual weight to it. Pugh, alongside the always welcome Sebastian Stan, a lovably goofy David Harbour, and Lewis Pullman as the surprising heart of the film, give the audience characters worth investing in, an example I hope Marvel learns from moving forward. Shifting outside the superhero realm of blockbusters, I found Wicked for Good and Mission Impossible: The Final Reckoning as equally underwhelming second halves to their respective stories. Both feel like they could have been trimmed down and combined with their predecessors, and are mainly only worth seeing for one or two central set pieces. Seriously, if nothing else, at least look up the biplane sequence in Mission Impossible: Final Reckoning. It almost makes up for the 2 hours of exposition, self-important dialogue, and flashbacks to previous movies that lead up to it. Now, I'm about to show my inner hypocrite here, as every criticism I just listed for these films could also be lobbed at my next blockbuster pick for the year, Avatar: Fire and Ash. James Cameron's darling franchise has become known for its reputation as the blue alien movies everyone flocks to in theaters, but seemingly forgets immediately afterwards. My theory about this is also oddly my reason for appreciating these movies, which is that the Avatar films, more than any other franchise, need to be seen on the biggest screen possible, and yes, need to be seen in 3D. They're the only films I'll put the glasses on for because, unlike other films, it unlocks something special, a heightened awareness of detail that could otherwise go unnoticed. Without this immersion effect, there's admittedly less to justify the weaker elements, such as wonky dialogue, repetitious plotting, and cultural themes that, let's face it, when viewed metaphorically or applied to real-world context, are problematic to say the least. I've always agreed with these criticisms while conceding that I'm no less enveloped in this world while viewing it the way it was intended. And I found this latest installment's relentless pacing, stunning large-scale action, and captivatingly bizarre payoffs to certain subplots is quite possibly the strongest implementation of technical prowess at work in the franchise. What I'm trying to get at here is that this is the one where things finally got weird, and for that it might just be my favorite of the three. It offers something entirely its own and leans into the campy impulses that were only flirted with in previous installments. Speaking of flirting, Stephen Lang, looking more comfortable than ever in blue, and newcomer Una Chaplin as ferocious tribe leader Varang make an iconic and surprisingly horny duo of villains that adds a much-needed dose of originality and weirdness to the world of Pandora. At the end of the day, Fire and Ash is far from perfect, but if you're like me and whale trials, space drugs, and battles on top of giant hot air balloon creatures sounds like a good time, then maybe give this one a shot. Before moving on to the next genre, I have to go to bat for two blockbusters I thought went underappreciated, or more accurately, overhated this year. And if you're looking for anything resembling a hot take on this podcast, I guess this is it. The two movies in question are Tron Ares and Jurassic World Rebirth. Yes, I, like everyone else, can only view Jared Leto as a soulless stain on the industry, void of charisma and charm. But thankfully, Tron Ares casts him as an AI program that is also void of charisma and charm, so he's fairly easy to ignore here. The blaring soundtrack, jaw-dropping visuals, and well-designed action sequences work overtime to distract from the third-grade level dialogue, and for me at least, that made it worth seeing on the big screen. Jurassic World Rebirth is almost identical in its strengths and weaknesses, though I'd say the screenwriter at least made it to high school. Director Gareth Edwards has never been the best storyteller, but his penchant for scale is almost unmatched. The dino-centric set pieces he crafts here are easily the best in the franchise since the Spielberg days, and it delivers on base blockbuster thrills while even providing a couple surprises along the way. Both of these movies are fundamentally flawed and warrant their respective criticisms, but I think it's worth mentioning that both understand the pacing and priorities of a proper blockbuster, which can often get lost nowadays in favor of convoluted world building and an overabundance of subplots. Transitioning us into my action picks for the year is a movie that could also fit nicely into the franchise blockbuster section, from the world of John Wick, Ballerina. Despite its devotion to a cinematic universe, complete with a Keanu Reeves cameo, this is a pure action movie at its core, which is why it ultimately works. It's sort of a miracle, really, given the production issues leading up to its release, including franchise maestro Chad Stahelski having to step in and refine some of the set pieces with reshoots. It's unclear, based on conflicting reports, how much he was actually involved, but whatever took place, it made for a cohesive action thrill ride that definitely has Stahelski's style. Despite a slower first half, the movie eventually drags Ana de Armas' Ballerina, along with her unique finesse-driven fighting style, into an all-out war with a town full of assassins. It's at this point that the movie reaches adrenaline-pumping heights and exercises the series' penchant for excess and comic book insanity. Watching this late in its theatrical run in an empty auditorium with surround sound shaking my chair with every gunshot and explosion was, without a doubt, one of the most special movie-going experiences I had all year. In fact, it was a special year for action in general, as it also gave us releases from two of the best directors working in the genre today, in Timo Tahanto's Nobody 2 and Gareth Evans' long-awaited Tom Hardy-led Havoc. Tahanto's sequel to the Bob Odenkirk action comedy brought much more life and kinetic energy to the table that was severely lacking in its predecessor. The colorful aesthetic allows for the humor to jive a little better with the violence this time around, and creates a tone I imagine they were originally going for with these movies. Evans' Havoc, on the other hand, his first pure action film since his magnum opus Raid 2, is a pitch-black neo-noir fever dream, soaked in pulp and cynicism, somewhat resembling a gritty late 90s graphic novel. The movie keeps its thematic ambitions humble and wrapped in cliches, while maintaining a focus on the bombastic action set pieces that are every bit a tribute to John Woo's heroic bloodshed movies, as much as they are Evans' own brand of Steadicam hyperviolence. This year also delivered some surprises in the action genre, the first one being Novocaine, starring leading man on the rise Jack Quaid. The film utilizes its clever conceit of an everyman who can't feel pain facing off against hardened criminals for both action and comedy. There's even a clever torture sequence here that might be one of the best comedic set pieces of the year. Another underrated action gem of the year was Sisu Road to Revenge. Similarly to the Nobody films, the sequel felt like the movie Finnish director Jalmari Helander and lead Jorma Tormilla had in them the whole time. Where the first Sisu was a tight skirmish between Nazi soldiers and a silent gold miner with a John Wick-style reputation, Sisu Road to Revenge is a sprawling, non-stop Mad Max-style chase between our lead and a Soviet killer named Dragunov, played by Stephen Lang as yet another scene-stealing villain. This movie blends its over-the-top violence with borderline Looney Tunes absurdity, reminding me as much of last year's cult hit Hundreds of Beavers as it does any action movie. The third act, featuring a Soviet locomotive, is a masterclass in visual storytelling through action, and caused an audible exclamation of "what the actual fuck" in my theater, which, as we all know, is the telltale sign of any great movie. Next up, we have my thriller picks, which I have to say arrived in abundance this year. Of the four Stephen King adaptations of 2025, my hands-down favorite was The Long Walk. Director Francis Lawrence, a veteran of the Hunger Games franchise, revisits familiar territory with yet another dystopian survival competition. The difference here is that since the game consists entirely of young men walking for miles, we really get to invest in these characters and their journey. Cooper Hoffman and David Johnson each prove they're two of the most dynamic and compelling young actors of their generation, and the entire ensemble lives up to their example. Looming over all of them is a one-note but effectively menacing Mark Hamill as the general, ready to fire upon anyone who falls behind. This movie is an absolute emotional endurance test, but it manages to navigate its plunge into darkness without ever feeling repetitive, only creating more suspense and hope that at least one of our beloved characters makes it out alive. The ending is a bold swing that might even outdark the book. It's ambiguous, but it's hard to tell if that was intentional or not. Regardless, it leaves things in an uneasy place that accentuates the desperation of the film's world, which is unfortunately all too similar to our own. Equally harrowing, but much more propulsive, is the real-time war movie Warfare. Co-directed by Alex Garland and Ray Mendoza, the film depicts a real-life encounter involving Mendoza's platoon during the Iraq War, with a script written entirely based on accounts from the platoon members themselves. This attention to realism allows Warfare to transcend typical criticisms of war movies. It's not a political statement or a glorification of war, but rather the simple horrifying truth of it. The sound design, special effects, and research performances are all calculated to create a sort of interactive museum exhibit from hell. Even the film's lightest moment, which precedes the violence, where soldiers scream along to the music video of 2004 dance hit Call on Me, is a sobering revelation that these are just hormone-driven young men who've barely reached adulthood and are mere hours away from having to fight for their lives. Not everyone is going to want to live in that space for 2 hours, and that's completely understandable, but it's a great example of how film can share a perspective we might otherwise never be able to relate to. From battles waged with guns and grenades to those waged with pack mentality and inventively cruel nicknames, my next thriller pick is Charlie Pollinger's directorial debut, The Plague. It follows 12-year-old Ben as he attempts to blend in with the cool kids at his water polo camp, who share with him rumors that outcast Eli suffers from a disease known as the plague. This movie tapped into a long-dormant chamber of my brain that holds every microaggression and biting word I endured from kids in middle school. For many children, the fear of not being like everyone else and the struggle to accept, let alone love, what makes us different is such a universally tender and human thing, something very few movies capture as well as this one does. From haunting music to claustrophobic underwater cinematography, Pollinger uses every filmmaking tool at his disposal to forge what is essentially a pubescent coming-of-age horror story. It's all treated with the seriousness and urgency that this sort of bullying evokes when we're young, creating a tension that eventually erupts into a cathartic finale that left me with goosebumps in the theater chair. I highly recommend this one to anyone with some serious demons to exercise from their preteen years. Moving on to more genre-adjacent thrillers brings us to Steven Soderbergh's second release of the year, Black Bag. I have to admit, Soderbergh has never really been the guy for me. His films have a sheen and winking cleverness to them that just puts me off. However, for reasons I still can't put my finger on, this one had me buckled in for the ride from its opening minutes. In fact, it's not the only one of his to do that to me this year, but we'll get there later. Black Bag follows a married pair of intelligence agents tasked with hunting down a rat within their department, which ends up testing not only their skills, but their relationship. A lesser movie would have made this a Mr. and Mrs. Smith-style romp, slowly building to Michael Fassbender and Cate Blanchett, trying to murder each other in their own fancy home. Instead, it's a psychological examination of trust, power, and relationships, making it the most surprisingly romantic film of the year. Soderbergh works these themes neatly into the dialogue while unraveling an engrossing mystery, all in a neat 94-minute package. So despite my thoughts on his previous works, I have to respect this one. Another thoughtful thriller from last year's lineup is the ever-subversive Kiyoshi Kurosawa's Cloud. What begins as a dark character study about online resellers slowly devolves into a chaotic action comedy that shines a spotlight on desperation in a capitalist society, as well as the growing social disconnect created by the internet. By slowly and sneakily turning the story into a violent tragedy of errors, Kurosawa brilliantly articulates how easy it is for us to dehumanize each other when we solely prioritize wealth over everything. I genuinely wasn't sure what to make of this one upon first viewing, but as the year went on and the more I fixated on it, the more I just couldn't get it out of my head. Okay, for my last thriller pick of the year, we're going to throw the heady stuff right out the window, because we're talking about Paul Feig's The Housemaid. Based on Frida McFadden's bestseller of the same name, and starring the uncontroversial and universally beloved Sydney Sweeney, the story follows a young woman with a troubled past who gets a seemingly normal job as a housemaid for a seemingly normal family. It's not long before it's made clear the married couple, played by the incredible Amanda Seyfried and the increasingly impressive Brandon Sklenar, are hiding dark secrets. I don't want to give too much away about plot specifics, as watching the convoluted madness unfold is part of the charm, but you could probably tell this is a campy piece of cinematic junk food. I don't even mean that negatively, as I think the guilty pleasure itch of this movie is trying to scratch is a stunning success. The theater I was in audibly reacted more to this one than any other movie I saw this year, and it's all by design. I myself, having been mostly unimpressed with Feig's work in the past, was expecting something more like last year's The Roses, which is a glossy, watered-down shell of its source material. But instead, I was impressed by how the housemaid picked a tone and slammed on the gas. I might still feel burned by those stupid Simple Favor movies, but in this case, I have to say Paul Feig made something pretty cool here. Next up, we're turning out the lights for my horror picks of the year. While I can't speak much to the franchise hits of the genre, as I missed both Black Phone 2 and Conjuring Last Rites, I can say that original horror gave us plenty to chew on in 2025. There will be a couple of notable exclusions here, as they may or may not be in my top 10, but here are a few others I enjoyed. First up, we have Bring Her Back, a bleak and nasty follow-up to directors Michael and Danny Philippou's Talk to Me. They dial up the dread and gore even more than before with a tale of a brother and sister forced to live with a foster mother with supernatural secrets. I like to consider myself a fairly tough-skinned horror enthusiast, so it means a lot when I say that there are two scenes in this movie that viscerally crawled under my skin and have remained there ever since. Sally Hawkins is utterly brilliant in a daring role she amusingly chose to take in place of reprising her role in the Paddington franchise. It's an uncomfortable but deeply moving cinematic experience that I will happily recommend but possibly never watch again. Another horror movie that unsettled me, only in a very different way, was Osgood Perkins' third in just 2 years, Keeper. Where I felt Longlegs and the monkey wrestled with conflicting tones, this one actually benefits from making the audience guess if they're supposed to laugh or run away from the screen and never look back at any given moment. Tatiana Maslany gets a well-deserved leading role as a cautious woman who joins her boyfriend in a cabin in the woods. The setup and execution are fairly restrained, as answers to mysteries and genre elements are ever so slightly hinted at in dark corners and dream sequences. That is, until the floodgates finally open in the third act and Perkins gives into his trademark knack for creating unhinged nightmare fuel. The last image of this movie is the kind that at least feels burned onto the screen, if not into your mind well after the credits roll. Speaking of memorable final shots, my next pick is another version of relationship horror, Michael Shank's impressive feature-length debut, Together. I avoided this one for a while, suspecting it to be part of a recent trend of horror that's more metaphor than anything else, which usually makes for what feels like an incomplete experience. But what it turned out to be instead was a character-driven psychological horror that just so happened to double as a thoughtful exploration of codependency. Oh, and did I mention there's body horror? Lots and lots of disgusting body horror. It was an inspired choice to cast real-life couple Allison Brie and Dave Franco as the leads, though Franco's acting talent leaves a little to be desired here, especially when Brie is right there acting circles around him. Still, their chemistry makes the stunt worth it, and I don't know that the surprisingly touching finale hits as hard with a different actor in Franco's place. My final horror pick is one that probably flew under the radar for most, but is essentially cinematic catnip for me, and that's musician Flying Lotus's Ash. It's a psychedelic mindfuck of a space thriller that blends sci-fi video game iconography with acid-tinged visuals and an eerie score by Flying Lotus himself. There's admittedly a lack of polish in the screenwriting and direction, but it's overcome by Lotus's sense of tone and style that transcends its less than $1 million budget. For fans of sci-fi horror in the vein of Event Horizon or Sunshine, get your hands on this one as soon as possible. Hopefully it will have a resurgence on streaming at some point, as it's easily one of the most underrated films of the year. While we're in cosmic territory, let's move on to my science fiction fantasy picks of the year, starting with the French animated adventure Arco. It follows a young boy from an idyllic future who accidentally travels back in time when the world is still suffering from an environmental crisis. This is storytelling at its most efficient, relying on stunning visuals and subtle character beats to pack an impressive amount of heart and character development into a fairly short runtime. Not to mention, the final moments pack an emotional wallop I was not prepared for. For fans of Studio Ghibli and Miyazaki, this one is not to be missed. 2025 also treated us to some action-packed crowd pleasers in the sci-fi realm with Dan Trachtenberg's pair of entries in the Predator franchise, the animated Predator Killer of Killers, and the anticipated follow-up to Prey, Predator Badlands. While Badlands is inarguably a franchise blockbuster, and Killer of Killers has more bone-breaking action than almost any movie this year, I think what both of these movies do better than anything else is build out a living, breathing world with depth and texture, something the franchise has struggled with up until this point. These movies blend elements of sci-fi, westerns, samurai films, and classic fantasy, threading the needle between broad blockbuster appeal and genre detail that scratches a certain niche for nerds like myself. While I was skeptical as the Yautja as hero approach at first, I'm now fully on board and excited to see wherever Trachtenberg and company wants to take us next. Next up is a film I wanted to make a point of categorizing not as horror or action but as fantasy, and that's Guillermo del Toro's long-awaited adaptation of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. This movie turned out to be far more polarizing than the triumphant, undisputed masterpiece we all anticipated, with everything from its Netflix release to the film's structural approach being challenged by audiences and critics alike. Given my own deep adoration for Del Toro's work, I thoroughly enjoyed the experience, but even I struggled with the kind of experience it turned out to be. That is until I accepted it for what it was, a dark and tragically romantic fantasy. Granted, most Guillermo del Toro films could be described this way, but this one sees him leaning into it more than ever. Even amid the gothic imagery and occasionally shocking violence, the film is truly about finding and holding on to the wonders of life through it all. This idea was most successfully executed in Del Toro's unimpeachable masterpiece Pan's Labyrinth, but what makes Frankenstein stand apart is that it takes that childlike perspective and places it into a character that the world not only doesn't view as a child, but views as a monster. Sprinkle in some father-son trauma, and this is essentially every idea Guillermo has ever played with, but when combined, it becomes something wholly unique. His Frankenstein could never be a horror movie because he loves the creature too much. So it's no surprise that the second half of the film, told from the creature's perspective, is where the story really comes to life. Now, I've seen plenty of criticisms of the first half, which focus on Oscar Isaac's Dr. Frankenstein being a bit of a slog. But I found it fascinating how so much of this character's insecurities and trauma are either heightened or reflected in his creation. And as for deviations from Shelley's novel, many of the original themes that go unexplored are simply set aside to make room for Guillermo's vision. He clearly knows the source material inside and out, and while he maybe didn't deliver the best or most definitive version of this story, he harnessed it as a vessel to say exactly what he wanted to with it. And that, as far as I'm concerned, is all we could ever really ask for from the best of our modern storytellers. And now for something that couldn't possibly be more different, with my final pick in sci-fi fantasy being the universally praised surprise hit K-pop Demon Hunters. As a 34-year-old man with zero connection to K-pop, I was in no particular rush to see this one. But as word of mouth grew and its impact became wholly undeniable, I gave in to the curiosity and fired it up on Netflix. To my surprise, I don't think I moved or looked away from the screen the entire time. This is a fun, infectious, colorful, and at times emotionally moving piece of pop art that more than lives up to its catchy tunes. There isn't much else to say other than if you haven't caught up with it, take it from a former naysayer, this one is worth the watch. As far as my comedy picks go for this year, considering it's a genre that's constantly evolving and being redefined over the last decade or so, I feel like 2025 contributed some pretty solid efforts on that front. We had everything from mainstream hits like Good Fortune, starring Keanu Reeves as a guardian angel, to avant-garde comedies like Splitsville, a shoe-in for best action set piece in a comedy for the year, with some solid genre crossovers sprinkled in for good measure. The best of those crossovers was sci-fi thriller comedy Companion, which turned out to be as much a riff on Terminator as it is a scathing satire of fragile masculinity. This theme is embodied beautifully by Jack Quaid as a top-tier douchebag who brings his companion bot, played by a standout Sophie Thatcher, on a vacation with friends which turns out to be more than meets the eye. This is a movie best seen with a couch full of friends who know nothing about it, as every twist feels perfectly calculated to invoke a reaction from the audience, creating an experience that is both increasingly intense and riotously funny. As far as pure comedy goes, I gotta hand it to the movie I least anticipated after seeing its trailers, Akiva Schaffer's Liam Neeson-led reboot of The Naked Gun. I was bracing myself for yet another cynical revival of a familiar IP, but what I got instead was a relentlessly funny merging of the late great Leslie Nielsen's deadpan humor with Lonely Island-style absurdity that left me with a massive smile on my face. Most surprising, however, was seeing Pam Anderson's comedic chops on display, as she manages to upstage Neeson's own impressive deadpan skills. If anything, The Naked Gun proved that these types of Hollywood comedies aren't dead after all. Delving into more niche territory, we have idiosyncratic icon Tim Robinson starring in his first feature-length platform, Andrew DeYoung's Friendship. It's important noting with any Robinson project that it's either going to be right up your alley or miles away from it. His acute understanding of masculine insecurity and uncomfortable social situations are so dialed in here that it might not even register as comedy for some. Robinson's character Craig is obsessed with his budding friendship with new neighbor Austin, played by Paul Rudd, who downshifts his usual comedic flair to make room for Robinson's excess. Despite the absurdity, there's a level of empathy found in Craig's desperate search for acceptance in a world that doesn't give us a training manual for these sorts of things. Granted, that empathy is tested when the vessel for these themes is this narcissistic and off-putting, but it's a testament to the strength of Robinson's capabilities as a performer that I was still watching with cautious optimism, hoping his character would just eventually figure it out. So as I hinted at, this movie is absolutely not for everyone. But if you're like me and you find humor in strange places, both in your media and in the real world, then this one just might be for you. And before we get serious for my drama picks of the year, I'd like to give a special shout out to this year's remake of the 80s trauma trashterpiece, The Toxic Avenger. It takes the campy hyperviolence of the original and injects a knowing sense of humor that makes it its own, pulling off the unlikely feat of finding a place for the character in 2025. I'm kind of hoping to see more of these in the near future, maybe even in the form of a modern Trumaverse. In the drama category, we have a lot of continued trends from recent years, some genre crossovers, and even some meta-commentary. I'll start with a pair of films I saw at the New Hampshire Film Festival this year, both of which coincidentally focus on a different crises facing the youth in modern America. The first is Rosemead, starring Lucy Liu as a mother concerned about her son's dark new interests. It's based on a story that I was completely unaware of going in, and boy did that make this one hit like a truck by the time it reaches its harrowing climax. Liu is brilliant, and the screenplay deftly communicates the nuances of its heavy themes of mental health and violence, especially within the context of a Chinese-American perspective. I think this one is getting at least a limited release at some point in early 2026, so while it's a tough watch, I highly recommend seeing it for its importance. Then there's Omaha, another drama that could be considered a parental horror movie where a father is forced to make an impossible decision to protect his children after a family tragedy. John Magaro gives a devastating performance as the lead, whose very real and relatable pain is felt in the weight he carries in his eyes, even as he hides a horrible secret from his son and daughter. Speaking of the kids, both young actors are phenomenal, and I would not be surprised if they were allowed a fair amount of improvisation, given how genuine both performances feel. On the more sentimental side, there were some films that, from their marketing, appeared unintentionally hammy or overly sweet that ended up containing far more depth than I expected. For instance, in the case of Roofman, starring Channing Tatum and Kirsten Dunst, I was fully prepared for a film that made light of its crime elements in favor of quirky romance. Instead, Tatum and Dunst give very grounded performances, and while they do have a lovely rom-com level chemistry, the script never forgets the real-world consequences hanging over it all. Similarly, the latest entry in the Brendan Fraser Renaissance project, Rental Family, could have easily squeezed every last ounce of sweetness out of its unique premise. It follows a struggling actor hired by a Japanese company to play various roles for people who are grieving or want to create a certain life experience. I was impressed by the consideration director Hikari gives his conceit, both in terms of the moral implications it brings attention to, as well as how it relates to Japanese culture in comparison to others. Yes, I ultimately left the theater feeling emotionally manipulated, but just like Fraser himself, it was so unabashedly earnest that I came out feeling rewarded instead of tricked. On the far more daring side of the spectrum, there was a trio of films this year all about women and directed by women that each contained some of the most abstract, challenging, and confident filmmaking I'd seen all year. The least successful of the three, though still fascinating, was Lynn Ramsey's psychological motherhood thriller Die My Love. I have to confess that I only made it about 2/3 of the way through this one because it was immediately after watching the next film I'll talk about, and together they replicated the feeling of a crushing panic attack that I did not want to relive in that moment. I'll happily give it another shot in the future and would recommend it regardless, if for no other reason than to see the rest of Jennifer Lawrence's unhinged performance. The second anxiety-inducing film in question is Mary Bronstein's If I Had Legs, I'd Kick You, another story about the pressures of being a mother while the rest of the world seemingly couldn't care less about you. Rose Byrne is phenomenal as a character who at any given turn is either sympathetic or incredibly frustrating. But Bronstein and Byrne always make sure the audience has access to understanding, if not entirely condoning her actions. Adding to the unsettling, uncut gems level tension of the filmmaking is the fact that we never see her daughter's face, who struggles with a condition that keeps her from eating. The more I think about this movie, the more I think it might actually be a masterpiece, albeit one I'll probably never be able to endure again. Finally, we have German director Masha Shalinsky's dreamlike, decade-spanning epic Sound of Falling. This one gets my Still Can't Figure It Out award for 2025, and while in most cases I might find that deeply frustrating, it only makes me want to watch it again. I want to pull out each and every piece of its labyrinthian plot and spread them out to see how it all fits together. It's a fascinating puzzle box whose only obvious connecting thread is that it follows women of different generations and eras coming of age on the same farm. There are no chapters, no obvious edits telling us where or when we are at any given time, only tactile imagery, dreamlike music, and a hauntingly beautiful mystique hanging over it all. If nothing else, I'm excited to see whatever Shalinsky makes next and how it plans to so exquisitely scramble my brain again. As far as films with awards potential this year, there seem to be some unanimous contenders, as well as some very polarizing ones. For instance, no one seems to know what to do with Chloe Zhao's Hamnet, a movie that I find myself agreeing with both the criticisms and praises of. As a tribute to Shakespeare, it feels unnecessary and a little like a superhero origin story at times. However, as a showcase for Jessie Buckley being one of the strongest actors of the century, it's a knockout. And the finale is an undeniable triumph, of which my only criticism is the overused piece of music implemented during a pivotal moment, whose power only gets lessened with every tear-jerking scene I see it accompanying. That being said, I still audibly sobbed at the end of this, so maybe I'm the fool. Another passable movie elevated by its third act is Noah Baumbach's J. Kelly. I love what this movie has to say about George Clooney's legacy and persona as a movie star, and kudos to him for signing up for something so self-aware. It didn't always work for me, though. There were times when I wasn't sure how this film wanted me to react to a given scene. It's attempting the kind of high-wire balance between fun road trip comedy and deep character exploration that Alexander Payne could do in his sleep, while Baumbach struggles navigating it a bit here. I like Baumbach characters best when they're sitting together and picking at each other's wounds, which this movie gets to do a few times, especially in scenes with Jay Kelly's manager Ron, played by Adam Sandler, and an old friend of Jay's, played by the always underrated Billy Crudup. And as I mentioned, it eventually sticks the landing in a big way, but I can't help but feel like this movie would have benefited from narrowing its focus on the central relationships and meta-ness of it all. Before getting into my top 10 of the year, I wanted to share some honorable mentions. These were all somewhere in my top 10 at one point in the year, but for one reason or another landed just outside. This first one is in my honorable mention simply because I don't know if I could technically call it a 2025 release, and that's Quentin Tarantino's Kill Bill: The Whole Bloody Affair. This is a project I've waited 2 decades for, ever since hearing whispers of it screening in LA and hoping that one day I'd be lucky enough to see it myself. Well, not only did I see it, but I got to see it in 70mm at a sold-out screening at the Coolidge Corner Theater in Brookline, Mass. And as far as I'm concerned, this might as well have been the premiere 20 years ago at Cannes. Every badass one-liner, every slice of a limb, every bold needle drop came accompanied with a gasp or a cheer from the audience. And watching this revenge-fueled love letter to 70s Asian cinema unfold as one 4-hour saga was kind of like seeing it for the first time all over again. As we continue to learn the questionable nature of Tarantino as a person, I can't deny the impact this movie had on me when I was younger. You could take 10 of my favorite films and see the DNA of Kill Bill, so for that, I will always have a special place for it in my heart. Even the few gripes I had with the original 2-movie version of this are more or less smoothed over here, including a certain reveal that shifted from the halfway point to the last 30 minutes, which serves as a gut punch with far greater effect. So again, I'm not sure if this qualifies here, but it was definitely one of the most memorable experiences I had in a theater all year, and for that, I'm grateful. Moving on to movies that unquestionably came out in 2025, Wake Up Dead Man was another fascinating curveball for director Rian Johnson and his Knives Out mystery franchise. This time around, the real mystery is a question of faith, and while Daniel Craig is back to ham it up as Benoit Blanc, the lead is Josh O'Connor as Judd, a well-meaning Catholic priest with a troubled past. When the radical Monsignor Wicks, played by a ferocious Josh Brolin, is mysteriously killed, Blanc and Judd team up to get to the bottom of it and clear Judd's name. After the borderline cartoonish antics of the franchise's previous installment, Glass Onion, I was taken aback by the meditative nature of Wake Up Dead Man. As they dig further into the mystery, the characters, especially O'Connor's, are forced to confront all kinds of moral and philosophical conundrums, and that's when the film most lives up to its potential. It definitely runs a little longer than necessary, and a lot of the promising ensemble is admittedly wasted here. But overall, I found this to be an incredible and welcome return to idea-driven filmmaking for Rian Johnson, a director who I'm always rooting for. Speaking of guys with plenty of ideas, Mike Flanagan's take on the Stephen King short story The Life of Chuck was a slow burn of an emotional and thought-provoking journey spread out over 3 unique segments. This movie challenged my take on sentimental filmmaking, as it helped me realize that landing a story in a profoundly sweet place isn't always manipulative. Sometimes it can be powerful, especially when the story starts in a literally apocalyptic setting. I know I'm being vague about the details here, but it's worth seeing what the initial setup unfolds into. I appreciate that Flanagan isn't afraid to confront the darkness, but this is an example of him facing the light, and I think that's the reason this has unexpectedly stuck with me ever since. Another genre mashup that has to be seen to be understood is Steven Soderbergh's Presence. As I mentioned with Black Bag, this is the year where Soderbergh and I just synced up, and I'm finally picking up what he's putting down. I feel this even more so with Presence, a ghost story told through a series of eerie tracking shots from the ghost perspective, as it observes a disjointed family desperately trying to reconnect amid chaos. Similarly to one of my own personal favorites, A Ghost Story, Presence uses horror tropes to tell a deeply human story about love and loss. The film's relentlessly experimental energy reminded me of something M. Night Shyamalan would do early in his career, and seeing a veteran like Soderbergh put down his familiar tools and explore outside his comfort zone is inspiring to say the least. This is by far one of the most underrated films of the year, and I hope that eventually it builds the cult following it deserves. My final honorable mention is a movie that can't be ignored, starring a movie star that can't be ignored, and that's Marty Supreme, starring the Energizer Bunny of movie stars Timothée Chalamet. Just like the titular table tennis player, Chalamet is a man on a mission, and the power he brings to this role is simply undeniable. Director Josh Safdie takes his knack for hyperactive pacing and Scorsese-style New York cadence and blows it up on a massive scale. The 50s setting, 80s soundtrack, and 70s music form a very specific sense of place, fitting of a character and plot that bounce around as much as the ping pong balls do in this movie. The only thing keeping me at arm's length with this film is that while I love a flawed protagonist as much as the next guy, I found the moment where he's forced to confront these flaws, or at least overcome them, to be broad and disproportionate with all the mess he's left in his wake. Maybe that's the point, but I wanted to live in the aftermath of his reflection a little longer, given we only see more or less one side of him up until this point. Still, it's a movie that is undeniably well crafted, well cast, and another sturdy rung on the ladder of Chalamet's legacy as one of our best working actors today. And now, without further ado, it's time to talk about my top 10 favorite movies of the year. I could tell this year really left an impression on me given just how hard this list was to make. The films I ended up selecting all highlight different great things that are happening in the medium right now, and most of these movies are from established directors going strong and showing no sign of stopping, proving that despite the uncertain future of the theatrical experience, there's plenty of creative gas left in the tank to keep the industry thriving. At number 10, I have Begonia, the latest fever dream from modern cinema's crazy Greek uncle, Yorgos Lanthimos. Knowing only the basics of the plot and having no relationship with the source material, South Korean cult hit Save the Green Planet, I wasn't sure what to expect. I've seen enough Yorgos movies to know the shit would be hitting the proverbial fan at some point, but after a pair of sprawling bizarro epics and Poor Things and Kinds of Kindness, this one seemed as though it would be quaint in comparison. And I guess that's true to a point. The film follows Jesse Plemons and Aidan Delbus as conspiracy theorists, interrogating a CEO they've kidnapped, played by Emma Stone, in an attempt to get her to admit she's the alien they strongly believe her to be. As expected, the film heavily alludes to modern-day conspiracy culture and the current division in the U.S. Between this and last year's Civil War, Plemons is getting a little too good at portraying the darkest archetypes of modern civilization, and Delbus provides a humanizing counterweight in a more passive role in the story. Meanwhile, Stone offers up an extremely layered performance that's threading all kinds of tonal and narrative needles, and it might just be one of her best. I'll keep it spoiler-free, but I really do appreciate how the ending challenges much of what's been shown before it without completely rendering any established themes or moral implications moot. I think Poor Things might still be my favorite of Lanthimos' catalog, but between these two films lies the tug-of-war between hope and cynicism that makes him one of the most uniquely captivating filmmakers of our time. From one idiosyncratic mind to another, we have Wes Anderson's The Phoenician Scheme at number 9. I almost went the entire year without seeing this one, and boy am I glad I caught up with it. I think the criticism that Wes Anderson movies have become increasingly derivative of each other is not without merit. However, I find it impressive that within his little dollhouse world, he can still offer a handful of surprises and fresh, dramatic twists each and every time. Some work more for me than others, however, something about The Phoenician Scheme just got me. It follows the wealthy Zsa Zsa Corda, who reconnects with his daughter, a nun, in order to turn his entire estate over to her, but not before investing in one last enterprise. Benicio del Toro taps into an unspoken shame as Corda, buried underneath the absolute scumbag he presents on the surface, while Mia Threepleton, as his daughter, seemingly stares through him with cold eyes, slowly peeling back the layers to get to something resembling a human. It's a beautifully subtle interplay between the two, and both actors sell it at every step along the way. Of course, this is a Wes Anderson movie, so the entire cast is stacked from top to bottom and firing on all cylinders, though the easy standout is Michael Cera as a Norwegian entomologist, who is somehow just now making his Anderson debut. This is the exact type of movie that would have made me roll my eyes a decade ago. However, I've gone almost a full 180 on Anderson in recent years, and something about the globetrotting ambition, shockingly comedic violence, and underlying romance of this movie had me wishing I could have stayed at least another hour in its vibrant and meticulously crafted world. For my number 8, we're leaving the Manor Control behind for the utter chaos of Danny Boyle with his return to the beloved Don't Call Them Zombies franchise 28 years later. Years of space from Boyle's work made me forget how visceral and exciting his style is. From rapid-fire edits to cinematography that feels like the camera might just fly out of the operator's hands at any given moment, his style, according to all rules of filmmaking and physics, should not work, and that's exactly what makes him a genius. The film picks up, you guessed it, 28 years after a rage virus plagues the United Kingdom, as a father takes his son from their small island to the mainland to show him how to hunt the infected and survive in the wild. That only scratches the surface of the plot, but trust me when I say that what it eventually evolves into is unexpected, sprawling, and profoundly emotional. I appreciated that in contrast with the kinetic presentation, the storytelling and character work is patient and meditative. Boyle's compatibility with Alex Garland's writing proves once again that they're one of the strongest pairings in genre filmmaking, bolstered even further by incredible performances all around. Alfie Williams is a revelation as the young lead, and the different relationships with his father, played by Aaron Taylor Johnson, and his sick mother, played by Jodie Comer, are both beautifully realized and relatable. If all of this wasn't enough, the movie reaches a turning point halfway through, where the masterful Ralph Fiennes dominates the screen as a mysterious doctor, imbuing his role with both a complex pathos and theatrical gravitas. The ending leaves things in a very bizarre place that's bound to leave some people baffled and others intrigued. I was of the latter camp, and given there are 2 more sequels to come, it left me more excited than ever for the future of the franchise. While we're on the subject of legendary cinematic pairings, director Richard Linklater and Ethan Hawke team up for yet another all-timer in my number 7 pick, Blue Moon. It follows the lamenting Lorenz Hart, lyricist and former songwriting partner of Richard Rodgers, in a bar in 1943, moments after Rodgers' Oklahoma explodes onto Broadway opening night. What plays out is a real-time and suitably stage play-style unraveling of Hart's ego and insecurities, as he drinks and chatters endlessly without filter to anyone who will listen, including Rodgers himself and an up-and-coming actress played by Margaret Qualley, with whom he's infatuated with. I forgive anyone who views the character of Hart and in turn Hawke's portrayal of him as annoying or insufferable. I, however, found that Hawke's ability to tie a palpable sadness to all of Hart's theatrics, along with dialogue that is both witty and intentionally obnoxious, made this an endlessly watchable character study. As proven time and time again, most prominently in one of the best trilogies of all time, Linklater and Hawke do some of their best work when Hawke is sat down in a room with other talented performers and we're left to indulge in his eloquent and deliberate manner of speaking. While Hawke is far more likable than Hart, his performance suggests he relates to him, if for no other reason than his desperation to communicate a passion for life and the arts that he couldn't keep inside if he tried. A heartbreaking centerpiece with Rodgers and Hart on a staircase provides a tour through all the reasons Rodgers loves his former partner, as well as all the reasons he needs a break from him in rapid succession. With all the noise of comic book movies and blockbuster spectacle, it's simply refreshing to see that we as a society can still make damn good movies about people talking in rooms. Next up, at number 6, we have the very ambitious and very divisive Eddington. While I loved Ari Aster's early works, his 3-hour cinematic panic attack, Beau is Afraid, put me at arm's length with his vision, as I'm sure it did for many people. I admired the ambition but struggled to make sense of it as a cohesive piece of art. But his latest, Eddington, however, helped something click into place for me. Aster makes movies about his fears. Hereditary represents a fear of what we pass down and inherit. Midsummer is about the fear of relationships and loss of those relationships. And Beau is Afraid is his fear of the unpredictability and dangers of life. Therefore, Eddington uses the rawness of COVID-era uncertainty and cultural division to capture a fear that still haunts us in 2026, the fear of each other. Joaquin Phoenix plays Sheriff Joe Cross, who finds himself at odds with Liberal Mayor Ted Garcia when they disagree in regards to a mask mandate instituted in response to the COVID pandemic. Things escalate from there, both in expected and very unexpected ways. There's a satirical bite to the convenience in how just about every hot-button issue from the last 5 years makes its way into the fold. I can see some people being frustrated with its refusal to explicitly pick sides, but anyone who's looking closely enough will see it's more that Aster is holding everyone accountable, while admitting that he too doesn't have the answers. The film isn't built to be unlocked by asking what is Aster trying to say, but by asking what is he showing us, one can see that this is not only a cautionary tale, but a direct line drawn between the absurdities of political satire and reality, and that if we continue down this path as a society, the two will merge before we realize it. Aster turns this idea into a darkly comedic epic that he uses not to lecture us, but in hopes that we can all see our respective fears for the future within the text, and hopefully use that to empathize with each other moving forward. It's for this reason I think Eddington is one of the most important and effective pieces of filmmaking of the decade so far, and is sadly not losing its relevance anytime soon. Moving us only slightly away from real-world horrors and a little further into escapism is my number 5 pick, Weapons. Ever since sketch comedian turned director Zach Kreger exploded onto the scene with his debut Barbarian, I've been anxiously awaiting his follow-up. Needless to say, I was not disappointed. We were all there when the cryptic trailer depicting dozens of children fleeing their homes with arms spread wide created a feverish level of hype that seemed impossible to live up to. I had my theories on what Kreger was hiding behind the curtain, but I never could have predicted where the ride takes us nor how it gets there. I'll reserve for anyone who's listening the thrilling experience of seeing how it all unfolds, but the genre elements that are eventually introduced are both inspired and gleefully strange. The screenplay showcases a masterful blend of existential fear and awkward humor, but its strongest asset is in how it jumps between various perspectives, subverting expectations around every corner. Each segment slowly builds to an intense high, then shifts to another angle entirely. This not only allows the story to reveal itself in unique fashion, but it gives each of the talented ensemble a chance to carry the baton, drawing an unlikely thread between them all. Josh Brolin, Alden Ehrenreich, Austin Abrams, and Benedict Wong are all fantastic in their respective roles, but Julia Garner as the bruised but beating heart at the center of the story, and Amy Madigan as one of the most memorable horror villains of the century, really elevate this to instant cult classic status. While Barbarian told us Zach Cregger had something to say as an artist, Weapons proves it's something worth paying attention to. My number 4 is a movie that all at once became a political talking point, a generator of memes, a cinephile's wet dream, and an inspiration for the easiest Halloween costume ever. And that movie is Paul Thomas Anderson's One Battle After Another. I remember being turned off by the trailers for this one, as it seemed like a fairly small story that was being overblown to epic proportions. But after seeing it, I realized that's kind of exactly what the movie is, and it's also exactly what makes it so special. Loosely based on the book Vineland by Thomas Pynchon, the film throws us in a barely alternate present where a rebellion is forming to fight back against an oppressive fascist government. Rather than getting lost in the political weeds, the story narrows its focus to former rebel Bob's journey to find and rescue his daughter Willa, who's being hunted by the deranged Colonel Lockjaw, who believes himself to be Willa's biological father. On paper, it all seems pretty simple. There's a 40 or so minute prologue where the magnetic Tiana Taylor as Perfidia, a rebel and Willa's mother, choose every piece of scenery she can get her hands on, followed by a time jump to what is essentially a 2-hour chase. But the performances from Leonardo DiCaprio, Chase Infinity, Sean Penn, and Benicio del Toro ensure that there is always some sort of nuance, humor, or emotional heft every step of the way. These characters feel both organic and larger than life, allowing the film to be as much a pulpy thrill ride as it is a compelling drama. From what is possibly one of the best car chases ever put to film to Del Toro's carefree smirk while uttering the words "a few small beers," this thing is jam-packed with iconic movie moments that will be etched into the canon for years to come. Even by the high standards of PTA, One Battle After Another is special. While I experienced plenty of stress-inducing tension in the theaters this year, nothing got me as close to tearing the fabric from the arms of my theater seat as my number 3 pick, Surat. What begins as a meandering mystery about a father accompanied by his young son searching for his missing daughter in the Moroccan rave scene twists into a delirious and gut-wrenching nightmare trek across the desert, all to the beat of pounding electronic bass. Veteran actor Sergei Lopez shines as the father in a beautifully understated performance, while the surrounding cast of non-professional actors add a level of authenticity and depth to characters that are fairly thin on paper. Even the thunderous sound design and imposing landscapes become characters of their own, ones that almost appear to be warning our leads of the impossible nature of their desperate crusade. Similarly to its pulsating soundtrack, Surat's storytelling begins steady and rhythmic, slowly building to an overstimulating sensory assault. I'm not exaggerating when I say the final 30 minutes of this film reach an anxiety-inducing fever pitch that I didn't even realize was possible. And its final note, while anticlimactic on the surface, left me with a pit in my stomach that recontextualized how I viewed everything leading up to it. Simply put, Surat is elemental filmmaking at its finest. As of a month or so ago, I thought I had my list all figured out, at least from what I had access to. But sure enough, one little film on Netflix, of all places, stopped me in my tracks and completely blew me away. So much so that it landed right in my number 2 spot. That movie was Train Dreams. Based on the novella by Dennis Johnson and directed by Clint Bentley, the film uses the seemingly small life of Robert Grenier, a logger at the turn of the 20th century, to tell a sweeping tale of love, loss, and belonging. The plot is essentially a series of vignettes taking place primarily under the towering trees of the Pacific Northwest, as Grenier, soulfully portrayed by Joel Edgerton, does his best to play his part in the world, while only asking for his own small piece of it in return. Grenier is something of an anti-protagonist. He doesn't have grand ambitions, he is not Robert Supreme. He simply wants to live. By stripping the narrative drive down to such a human desire, it allows the film to pose massive questions, using the staggeringly gorgeous imagery of the aforementioned trees as an ongoing reminder of our minuscule place in this world. This might all sound like pretentious film snob gobbledygook, and in lesser hands it very well might have been. But Granier's exploits, both tragic and beautiful, move along briskly like a series of memories, with long stretches of time condensed to clever narration that sometimes even acts as a harbinger for what's to come, recontextualizing the impact or lack thereof of certain events we witness along the way. We're also treated to a handful of pitch-perfect supporting performances, with William H. Macy and Carrie Condon showing up for some of the film's most memorable moments. Train Dreams pulls off the impossible. It mines everything that makes being alive so beautiful and terrifying from an organic story, rather than contorting the plot into something that no longer resembles real life. It's where so many movies with similar ambitions falter, and I truly commend Bentley and company for quietly breaking that trend. I can see this one slowly gaining traction over the years and hopefully getting a well-deserved big screen release in the process. Now, you might have noticed there's been one glaring exclusion from the list so far that made a massive impact on 2025 cinematic landscape. And that's because Five Nights at Freddy's 2 is my #1 movie of the year. Don't worry, I'm kidding. It's Sinners, and you know it is. If Train Dreams represents my love for film as artistic expression, Sinners represents my love for film as entertainment, while also having impeccable craft, thematic resonance, and a strong creative voice. In short, Sinners is the whole package. Since Fruitvale Station in 2013, Ryan Coogler has been slowly building one of the most consistent filmographies of any director this century, and actor Michael B. Jordan has been there with him almost every step of the way. So it shouldn't have been much of a surprise that they teamed up once again after Coogler came out of the other side of the Marvel machine and made a bold and wholly original cinematic masterpiece. Yes, Sinners is a vampire movie, and yes, that portion of it heavily tributes Robert Rodriguez's From Dusk Till Dawn. However, it's also a Prohibition-era period piece, a crime drama, a musical, and a meditation on the evolution of culture with a primarily black cast. All of that's to say that this movie only could have been made right now with this cast and with this director, and there's never been or ever will be anything quite like it again. I could spend an hour talking about the cast alone, but there probably isn't any better place to start than Michael B. Jordan's dual roles as twins Smoke and Stack. Setting aside the impressive technology that even makes this possible, Jordan just does such an incredible job of creating two wholly unique characters. So much that you know exactly who you're looking at any given moment based solely on facial expressions and mannerisms. This was exactly what he needed to finally prove to the world he can lead a project of this magnitude, and it's nice to see him getting the overdue recognition he deserves. This is the first year the Oscars will be handing out an award for casting, and I strongly believe Sinners is the top contender by a mile. From Wunmi Mosako's intense and spiritual Annie, to Delroy Lindo's troubled but loyal Delta Slim, and of course Jack O'Connell and his sneering charisma as Irish head vampire Remick. Both within and outside the movie's genre elements, there are character moments so powerful on the page that are only elevated by the nuance of the talented ensemble. I haven't even mentioned real-life musician Miles Caton, who slowly emerges as the film's true protagonist and proves that he has acting chops to match his powerful singing voice. Behind the camera, Coogler and his team's filmmaking is every bit a star of the show as much as the talented cast, proving an aesthetic that is both stylized and grounded in reality. The contrast of warm, natural light and eerie darkness effectively communicates the thin veil between our heroes and their surrounding threats, whether it's blood-sucking vamps or scheming clan members. The camera often moves like there's danger around every corner, even when there's not, building tension throughout the surprisingly character-focused first half before blood starts to spill in the second. Of course, we can't talk about the film's visuals without mentioning the breathtaking assault to the senses that is its musical centerpiece, a dance sequence that transcends time and reality and was stitched together seamlessly to appear as one smooth shot. There are so many moving parts and so many big swings in just this 3-minute sequence that could have made the entire thing collapse under its own weight if any of them were to fail. But it's a testament to Coogler's vision and the crew's complete faith in that vision that it not only works, but has already become an all-timer in cinematic history. While we're here, though, I'd like to take a brief moment to address the topic of media literacy, as I feel it was at an all-time low when it came to certain interpretations of this scene. I was truly shocked to see multiple critiques of the film saying, I was with the movie until people just started randomly twerking and wearing modern clothes in the 1930s. Guys, I don't know how to break it to you, but that's not what's happening here. Regardless, I'm glad the sequence still had the impact it did on so many people, as I feel it's a microcosm of everything that makes this movie special. Finally, there's the cherry on top, which is Ludwig Göransson's phenomenal score. Weaving imperfectly textured blues guitar into sweeping themes, Göransson captures something that feels handcrafted and grand at the same time. I'd be lying if I said I haven't started a few days by throwing on the Smokestack Twins track, which sort of feels like it walks you through those characters' entire journey in just a brief span of time. I kept waiting throughout the year for something to surprise me and usurp Sinners as my favorite movie of the year, if for no other reason than it was such an early release. But after a handful of rewatches, I've grown more positive that this was the one. A rare film that draws in a massive eclectic audience while connecting with individual viewers on a deep emotional level. As far as I'm concerned, Sinners is what movies should be, and I can only hope it inspires generations of future filmmakers to take the same risks. And those are my top 10 films of the year. I'm sad to say there were a handful I was unable to get to in time, including Sentimental Value, The Testament of Anne Lee, and No Other Choice, all of which I'm very much looking forward to. So maybe my ranking might shift around in the future, but something tells me Sinners isn't going anywhere. And that's one last take on the movies of 2025. Thanks so much for listening.